Diary of a Man in Despair. Friedrich Reck. October 1944.
Arrests, and more arrests. There is getting to be something akin to an arrest psychosis, which barely serves to conceal the terrible fear of the arresters. Tony Arco has been arrested. I am sure he bitterly regrets his assassination 25 years ago of Eisner. Schacht has been arrested, and old Hugenberg. Mayor Scharnagel has been arrested, and old ladies connected with royalty, and young religious novices. People disappear without trace. Nothing is heard of them for weeks and months. Whole families are separated in this way and sent off into the night. A has been arrested, Fr is also said to be in prison, his brother who holds the title of Count disappeared without trace in the course of a trip to Vienna. All that is known of him is that he was seen in handcuffs between two guards on a station platform somewhere in Austria. Barely 2 years ago, both of his sons were swallowed up in this war. Strange and grim news has been received about His Majesty. Her Vaughan M. has received the following word from northern Italy: do not worry about the colonel, he is safe in the Dolomites. In the context, there is no question that by the colonel is meant the 75-year-old King of Bavaria, the monarch who dipped into the store of memories of his youth to tell me such absorbing stories about his meeting with old Emperor Franz Joseph, and with Bismarck, and who described so well the enviable appetite of 90-year-old Wilhelm I at the breakfast table, and who now evidently is forced to wander from one mountain retreat to the other in a foreign land. Her Vaughan M. received this letter at the beginning of October. Now, at the end of the month, rumor has it that the king has been killed. The Nazis could hardly sink lower. I, however, can conceive of situations in which an enemy struck dead may be more dangerous than one left alive. And on the 13th, a beautiful, burning hot day in October, I was myself arrested. At 6 in the morning, that hour so beloved of all secret police officials, I heard the bell ringing rather loudly, and saw below our Seabrook gendarme, a good soul, who explained apologetically that he had come in performance of what was for him the unpleasant assignment of conveying me to the army jail at Traunstein. I confess that I was not greatly concerned. For days before, I had ignored a so-called call to arms for service with the Volkssturm, citing an attack of angina pectoris. Immediately thereafter, however, I had gone like any good citizen to regional headquarters to explain, and the opinion there had been that a man who had only just received word that his son was missing in Russia might well be believed regarding illness. I made a mistake. Deception, the burning hot autumn day with its gay colors, deception, the tact, bordering almost on shame, of the gendarme. We crossed the river on our way to the train, and the melancholy with which my womenfolk waved to me from the house made me thoughtful. A couple of hours later I knew that this was, indeed, more than a little warning. The gate of the army post closed heavily behind me. Between me and the bright autumn day there was a fence and a highly martial guard. I was standing in a guard post filled with the smell of leather, sweat, and lard, the chief personage of which was a young Swabian sergeant, a man with that peculiarly Germanic combination of choler, activity, and exactitude which never rings quite true, and which has caused so much evil in the world. I telephoned the major who was officer in charge. A voice so frigidly vindictive that the quality of it emerged quite clearly out of the receiver told me that I was not there to ask questions, but to wait. Then I happened to see a young officer I knew bicycling across the compound. I called to him, but when he came refrained from taking his hand because, as I explained, I had been arrested and so, in the jargon of the old Kaiser's army on the Eastern Front, I was lousy. He laughed, gave me his hand, and himself telephoned. As the crackle sounded from the receiver, he grew pale. He hung up, and then informed me, several degrees more formally now, that I was charged with undermining the morale of the armed forces. He bowed and left. The penalty for undermining the morale of the armed forces is the guillotine, on which the condemned man, as I heard recently, is granted the single act of grace of being blinded by 1,000 candle-power light just before the blade whistles downward, with the aftermath being one of the Lysol bottles of an anatomy class. In the meantime, however, evening had come on. The guard post was now a dark box. I was locked up. The cell is 2 paces wide and 6 feet long, a concrete coffin equipped with a wooden pallet, a dirty, evil-smelling spittoon, and a barred window high up on the wall. By climbing onto the pallet I can see a minuscule piece of the sky, the barracks compound, a section of the officer quarters, and behind, a pine forest of our lovely Bavarian plateau, which has nothing in common with this frenzy of Prussian militarism, this pestilence which has devastated Bavaria. So much for the window. On the walls, the inevitable obscenities and calculations of time still to be served, in weeks, days, hours, and minutes, even. Then, a veritable flood of Soviet stars, which gave the idea that the entire Red Army had been imprisoned here. And lastly, scratched into the concrete with a key, perhaps, the words, so very applicable to me, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" I read this, and darkness envelopes me. This was written by a man as close to death as I am. It is true that not one word has been said to confirm this idea. And yet, I cannot help registering the fact of this venomous animosity, which is intent on finding something against me, and would make of an ignored draft notice a matter for the hangman. It might well be believed of a 60-year-old man who had lived his life honorably and had just received word that his son was a prisoner of the Russians that a heart attack did not necessarily signify an undermining of the morale of the armed forces. And this would hold true even if there were not extant a statement to this effect by the senior physician in the town of Prien. But what is happening to me now has nothing to do with a draft notice. A night spent in heavy, labored breathing, while outside sounded the brutal army noises. We who are buried alive here are not to be granted even the solace of a quiet night. When a door is closed it is slammed shut with full force. When a man asks to be led to the stinking hole called the toilet, there resounds down the corridor the filthy curses of the roused guard. At 3 in the morning, the relief stamps with elephant tread on the parapet, and at 5:30, despite the fact that our being up cannot possibly be of benefit to anyone, and that our being asleep cannot harm anyone, the doors are ripped open to the bellow of "up." Just when one might be able to doze off after the worried, sleepless night. I pondered the question of who was responsible for this, who it was whose amiable purpose it had been to deliver me up to the hangman. I thought about the district leader whom I had taken to court for calling me a coward over my use of a watchdog, and I reflected that he might have chosen this way of revenging himself on me for having lost the case. I thought about the senile old coffeehouse orator whose mouthings of propaganda I had refused to applaud. And I thought about the housing commissar who found high treason in my customary greeting of "God be praised," and whom I was twice obliged to throw out of my house despite the fact that he was on official business of the governor. I thought of all these small, crawling things now finding their nourishment in denunciation and the decay of our country, murderers, large and small scale, now operating under cover of full legality, who have no idea that tomorrow they may be the ones for whom the hangman reaches. But I cannot enjoy the thought of what lies in store for them, and this fact makes me thoughtful. Strange, I have progressed. 10 years ago, I worked out plans for a terrible revenge upon them. And today, I know that no such thing as revenge exists, and that those passages in the Bible which emphasize this fact reflect an ancient, honorable wisdom. Revenge? Years ago, I took an old friend who had fallen into desperate straits into my house. He repaid my hospitality and my financial help by undermining my marriage. I beat him as hard as it is possible for one man to beat another. For 3 days afterwards, I experienced a feeling of relief. And then came the realization that all of this would not weigh greatly in the scales of eternity. If I had ventured deeper into the things that are God's and had actually killed him, I would thereby have helped him to a heroic death, instead of the prolonging of a dishonorable life. I myself have been responsible for the tears of many, and has it ever failed that I have not paid for these tears, even if retribution was years in coming? Don't I know that the things that are happening to me now, the approach of death, the separation from my loved ones, the filth, the attempt to degrade me, that all these things will be required, even if I am not there to see to it? A man need not be a Christian to know all this. But one must be a Christian to give form to this, and then heroically to live and die. In 1912, aboard an English coastal steamer, as untroubled a young man as only an innocent son of Wilhelmism could be, I theorized to the only other passenger, an old Chinese intellectual, in the course of an evening promenade on deck, that the whole of Christianity, everywhere in the world, now found itself in a single vast agony. The venerable old man, a follower of the precepts of Lao Tzu, professor of Asiatic religions at Tsingtao Academy, looked at me with amusement. Then he said quietly that Christianity still had before it its great and decisive task. I was deeply impressed by the way he spoke. Today, 30 years later, bowed as I am under the weight of responsibility for certain major sins, having attained to a certain height on some few occasions and fallen to certain depths on others, I know the thing is not so simple. Certainly, Christianity still has its great work before it. But in the face of the Satanism which now prevails, a second catacombs will be necessary and a second Nero's burning of Rome before the spirit may emerge victorious a second time.